Welcome to my live stream. My name is Aiden. I am an MCAT tutor, and I scored a 527 on the MCAT exam when I took it in April of 2025. Today's live stream is going to be facts and tips about the hormone topic on the MCAT. The MCAT biology content section treats hormones as an organ system, which they are considered to be, and it's called the endocrine system. So the MCAT categorizes hormones as part of the endocrine system. Hormones, endocrine system are synonymous with each other according to the MCAT. This can be found on content category 3A of the MCAT's content outline, which is called What's on the MCAT Exam and was published by the Association of American Medical Colleges in 2020. And it has basically two large. The content category that covers this has two large sections. One of them is endocrine system, hormones and their sources. The other is endocrine system, mechanisms of hormone action. So the first section is more about the organization in physical space of this system. What are the different what are the different tissues in the body that are responsible for this system? And then the second section is more on a molecular mechanism. well, what exactly is going on with hormones? How do they do the things that they do? So I am going to use a combination of the AAMC's content outline and also a common third party source called the Miles Down MCAT review sheets that, according to the first page of the publicly available PDF, was published in 2019 on this subject. So they have two sheets on this. One is called the endocrine system sheet, and it has an overview of what hormones are um, in terms of their subcategories, and then has a second sheet about all the glands. So I'm going to make sure that my eyes go over each of the topics that the Miles Down review sheets puts on there. And the reason I'm doing this live stream is to put my spin on things, explain how I was thinking about this, such that I scored a 527 on the exam. Hormones covers actually three sections of the exam, which is Chem Phys, Bio-Biochem, and Psych Soc. The first, second, and fourth section on the exam. Hormones are very important for the MCAT. They're high yield. High yield, meaning there's a lot of questions. You will yield many questions and many correct answers about the endocrine system. What is a hormone? A hormone is often described as a chemical messenger. It's this molecule that tells a part of your body what to do at a certain time. To me, when I was first learning this, that sounded an awful lot like the function of neurons or nervous tissue. The purpose of nervous tissue is to communicate throughout the body. And so, why is it that we would need to do something other than use nervous tissue and rely on these hormone molecules to communicate between different parts of the body? Why can't we just send a nervous impulse to our reproductive organs the uh, to start producing the reproductive cells, the germ cells? Why can't we just send a nervous signal for that? Why can't we just send a nervous signal to several target organs when we are in a fight or flight situation and we need to start using up more glucose quickly and start doing more cellular respiration? Why can't we just use nerves? That's because these That's because the things that hormones do are on a different time scale, and they are of a different category than the things that nerves do. And generally, what nerves do is very short term and immediate, and what hormones do is a little more long term and lasting. That is a generalization because, of course, hormones like epinephrine are used in myriad short-term contexts where things happen very quickly. But if you think about it, they actually don't happen even in that context as quickly as the propagation of an action potential, where we're talking on the order of milliseconds. Another way that I began to think about hormones when I was preparing for this section of the exam was to think about what it would be like if there weren't hormones, if there weren't these chemical messengers floating throughout the bloodstream and nervous system. In the nervous system, they're called neurotransmitters that had different actions on the body. What if it truly was all just nerves? Well, in that case, we could sort of just think about, oh, it's time to build a little bit more muscle right now. It's time to elongate our bones right now. Let me just okay, there it is. And just think that. And of course, not all nervous action requires conscious thought, but the principle remains that having that sort of feedback be so immediate when it comes to something like growth or maturation or sexual reproduction, the different parts of that whole process from intercourse to just producing germ cells day to day, having that be as immediate as a nervous impulse would be really weird. And it sounds weird because it's not the way that it works, and it would be weird if it did work that way. So, nature and evolution has decided that there's a reason and a place for these funky little molecules floating around the bloodstream, going from one organ to the other to have some sort of impact at some sort of time. Those are called hormones, and the system in which hormones act is called the endocrine system. Well, the system in which hormones travel is called the circulatory system. Hormones are released into the bloodstream by the various organs that I'm going to talk about today. So they are not really a complete system of their own, but they're called a system because if you take the bloodstream out of the equation and you just assume that these hormones can travel from one place to another, and you look at the glands and you look at the target organs, they really do start to resemble a proper system of their own. So that's why we call it the endocrine system. So, hormones are molecules, and as such, on the MCAT, test takers can integrate information from other domains of knowledge, namely chemistry and biochemistry. There are two main classes of hormone. There are the peptide hormones and the steroid hormones. Peptide and steroid. Now we're in the domain of biochemistry because we're talking about two different classes of biomolecule. Peptide being amino acid based protein sort of molecules, peptides being amino acid based, and steroids being lipid based. So rec- a quick primer on what the amino a quick primer on what amino acid based and lipid based actually means. Amino Amino acid based means that the molecules that are discussed when we are discussing peptide hormones are made almost entirely of the building blocks that you memorize the three-letter abbreviation and the one-letter abbreviation was of for the purposes of the MCAT, those building blocks. There are 20 of them, and they're what we call proteinogenic. Now, sometime with various modifications, those amino acids are what create peptide hormones. Peptide hormones are just a string of amino acids with a bunch of modifications. So, the class of molecule that peptide hormones are is something that will be familiar to you chemically by the time you get to the test because you've memorized the structure and the backbone structure, certainly, of all of those 20 amino acids. I mention this because MCAT test takers do not keep the question in the domain of a single field of study. They will not keep a question in the domain of endocrine system. Instead, they will introduce a question with a research study on the endocrine system and expect you to extrapolate a basic fact about, say, the chemical structure of one of the molecules involved in the endocrine system. So they'll say there's a peptide hormone. What's which of these atoms is in the backbone of the chemical structure of that hormone? Now, if those atoms include nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, and fluorine, so if those atoms include nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, and fluorine is going to be the one that is not included. So if they asked if it's not, which one is not included, that's got to be fluorine because it's not in the backbone of the amino acid structure. It might be elsewhere in the body for different reasons, in a different form, not elemental fluorine, I wouldn't think. But I digress. So that's what the MCAT is going to do. They're not going to keep all of the knowledge within the scope of the lesson that I'm teaching you today, or any lesson on the endocrine system, because that's simply not how the test is written, and that wouldn't be as efficient of a test for the sorts of things that they're trying to test you on the MCAT. So, without further ado, let's dive in. I've talked about peptide hormones. The other kind of hormone is steroid hormone, and they have some key differences that are elaborated in study aids for the MCAT and that I'm going to explain here in my own words. Starting with peptide hormones, they're made of amino acids, and thus they are peptides. But what happens when we use a peptide hormone that differentiates it in terms of its action from a steroid hormone? Well, first of all, it comes from a different place. It comes from a larger polypeptide chain. So the very origin of the molecule is going to be different than that of the steroid hormone. Then it goes through a couple of other processes. Like any polypeptide, the Golgi apparatus in the cell, which is one organelle of the cell, modifies it, and in this case, activates it, as it does so many other products of um, translation. So once it is modified by the Golgi apparatus, it is put into vesicles and released via exocytosis. Okay, so when we're releasing something via exocytosis, that means that it simply cannot diffuse across the cellular membrane on its own. And that's one point I want to mention, that I want to highlight rather. And that's one point I want to highlight about the peptide hormone, which is that they do not cross over the cell membrane on their own. That is because they are polar molecules. That is because they're small polar molecules. The cellular membrane is large and lipid based. Thus, one cannot diffuse into the other. Like dissolves like, the small polar nature of the peptide hormone means that it cannot cross the cellular membrane. But once it does get across the cellular membrane, it travels in the bloodstream without any help. That's because the bloodstream, being primarily water based, is a polar environment. So, there's two environments that I'm talking about here. One is the cellular membrane. The peptide hormone cannot cross the cellular membrane. Two is the polar water based environment of the bloodstream in the human body. The peptide hormone can exist in that bloodstream without any modification because it is soluble in the bloodstream. The peptide hormone remains in the bloodstream. It travels on its own. It needs no help for that. Finally, with the peptide hormone, when it gets to its target organ, or a cell rather, in a target organ, it acts upon the outside of the cell for the reason that I stated just earlier. It cannot get through the cell on its own, so it acts on the outside of the cell. Well, what's sitting on the outside of the eukaryotic cell? Receptors and a whole bunch of other stuff. But today we're talking about the receptors that the peptide hormones are going to attach to. It's like a lock and key. The peptide hormone gets there, it hits the right receptor, and then from there, the cell has what it needs to carry out the action that that peptide hormone is signaling. Things like kinases, things like other enzymes. The effects of the peptide hormone are thus immediate. It's protein action, which is very, very quick, especially compared to that of the other hormone class that I'm going to talk about next. The peptide hormone hits the outside of the cell, lock and key, acts quickly, and has a large effect. It has an amplification sort of effect on the target cell. One common example of this is the G protein coupled receptor pathway. Now, those pathways are not important for you to memorize for the MCAT exam, but GPCR, or G protein coupled receptor, is a term to just be generally aware of, especially if you're looking to go to medical school, which you are. So that's peptide hormones. An example of a peptide hormone, the most common example of a peptide hormone is insulin. And so the MCAT could ask numerous questions that I could think of now about how insulin is structured, what insulin acts upon, everything from metabolism to the chemical structure of a peptide hormone. Things like insulin, that sort of buzzword, really can activate a whole slew of different basic chemistry, biology, organ system questions. So that is peptide hormones. Amino acid based, do not amino acid based, do not diffuse through the membrane, can be in the bloodstream without any help, and act quickly and in a big way on their target organ. That's peptide hormones. Now, steroid hormones. First of all, where do they come from? They come from a different place than the peptide hormones. Whereas peptide hormones are made in the organelle of the cell, steroid hormones come from certain cells that the MCAT might want you to know. What are those cells? Well, they're cells that might have cholesterol. So, cholesterol is this molecule, it is the precursor to so many different products that our body needs to make. One of those products is the steroid hormone. And indeed, it is one of the most important ways that cholesterol is used in our body. We need cholesterol. And so, steroid hormones come from cells that have that cholesterol ready to produce the hormone. Those cells are in places like the gonads and the adrenal cortex. So the outermost layer of the gland that sits right on top of the kidneys. So that's the adrenal cortex. Steroid hormones might come from there, they might come from the gonads. Okay, so steroid hormones pass through the membrane without any problem. They pass through the cellular membrane. Why? Because they are nonpolar, just like the cellular membrane. So they go through the membrane. They pass right through. Peptide hormones, it's a block. They can't get through because they are small, or because they are small, relatively large, actually, compared to things that do dissolve straight through peptide hormones. And they can't get through the cellular membrane. Whereas with a steroid hormone, it is nonpolar, it can fit right through the cellular membrane. So once it's out of the cell, it's now in the bloodstream. And that's a problem for a steroid hormone because, as a large nonpolar molecule, it cannot dissolve in blood. So instead of being dissolved in blood, it is shuttled around by a carrier protein. So carrier protein is named as such because it carries things like cholesterol based hormones through our bloodstream. And one such protein that is relatively well known is albumin. So, albumin is an example of a protein that will be there to just take that insoluble product that is so important from one place to another in the body. Okay, so steroid hormones now, unlike the peptide hormones, they don't dissolve through the membrane, or they steroid hormones now, unlike the peptide hormones, they can go straight through the membrane. They can't dissolve in the blood, so they have to be carried by proteins. And then when they get to their target cell, indeed, they can pass through the membrane. Why is that? Because they're nonpolar. When they get into their target cell, they have a different mechanism of action from the peptide hormones. Rather than causing protein level action, they actually go into the nucleus of cells and have an effect on the transcription of DNA to RNA. Transcription is the process by which a slew of enzymes take the deoxyribonucleic acid molecule that contains the instructions for our cells, translates it into RNA. Well, it turns out that our body is not taking all of our DNA and transcribing all of it all the time. And how does our body know what to do, what to transcribe at what times? Transcription factors. Well, what can have an effect on the action of transcription factors? Things like steroid hormones. So, the process of transcription needs to be followed by the process of translation before any sort of effect can happen, because the end goal of transcription is to make, in part, proteins, which do the work of our body, of our cells, which make up our body. So, the steroid hormone will have a much slower onset of action because those processes whereby DNA is turned into RNA and then RNA is turned into protein and then that protein is modified and then activated for what it needs to do, that takes a much longer time than peptide hormones, where it just hits the outside of the cell. One protein affects another protein, and then the amplification happens, and you have action across the cell right away. So they are very different in the length of their onset. The steroid hormone, very long, very slow. The peptide hormone, very short, very fast. So that is the two main classes of hormone that are crucial to know for the MCAT. I want to just briefly mention a couple of clear, of big steroid hormone examples: testosterone, estrogen, cortisol. These are the ones that I think of the most when I try to reason out why we need an endocrine system in the first place. You can't simply think or have your brain directly tell your reproductive organs to mature when you're in your early teens, or yeah, when you're in your early teens. That just seems intuitively weird. It seems like there should be a longer acting, less sort of direct pathway for that sort of development to occur. Indeed, there is. It's called the endocrine system. The next topic is the amino acid derived hormones. So, peptide hormones, steroid hormones, these are the two main classes. Then there are amino acid derived hormones. So, It turns out you don't even need a whole peptide in order to have a hormone that is made of amino acids. You can literally take one amino acid, modify it a little bit, and boom, it's a hormone. Um, a good example of those are, the catecholamines. The catecholamines, very well known hormones, and they indeed are derived from single amino acids. So you have an amino acid, it acts as a hormone, and boom, you have the effect right there from that amino acid. So those would be the smallest class of hormones because they're not a peptide. A peptide is a string of amino acids. No, they're a single amino acid. It's been modified. Now it's a hormone. So zooming out from the molecular level, then, what are the different ways that hormones act in the body? Could we make a classification system based off of that? Indeed, we could. In the MCAT world, they are the direct versus the tropic hormones. So, a direct hormone acts directly on a target tissue and organ. It's in the name, direct hormone. So you take the hormone from one place, you put it onto the target organ, and boom, that target organ is the organ carrying out the effect that that hormone is made to produce. But that doesn't always happen because sometimes the target organ is simply another hormone producing organ that you want to produce another hormone. So, a tropic hormone is a hormone that requires another endocrine tissue to do its thing before the effect is taken. So, an example of this is, let's see, uh, gonadotropic releasing hormone, or GnRH. So GnRH is released from the hypothalamus. It goes on to the anterior pituitary gland to release follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland, two different parts of the body. They're very close together, as I'll soon describe, but they're two different parts of the body. And the GnRH is not going to have any impact on that third part of the body, which is the gonads, on its own. Instead, it is going to go to that middle man. It is going to go to the anterior pituitary and tell it to release its product. That's the way the system evolved to work. Okay? So you start with GnRH, you go to FSH or LH, and then you go to the reproductive organs in the body. Obviously, now we're on a much larger, we're a couple of feet away from the brain, and the hormones have traveled there, and then they have their effect. So that would be a tropic hormone, where the effect is not direct. It's not just it goes from the hypothalamus to the gonads. Instead, it goes from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary gland, which is really just right there, and then to the gonads. That is a tropic hormone. There are several other, some of which have more distant intermediaries. So it's not always the case that it goes from one to the next and then to the target organ, and the first two are really close together. Sometimes they're farther apart. The hormone system is all about things being far apart. Um, this is another really good reason why it exists, is because you can have nerves or everything go into everything, basically. Okay. When discussing when discussing peptide hormones, the topic of diabetes comes up as a way to synthesize a lot of different knowledge on the MCAT, and also it's a way for the MCAT to sound as if it's asking you a medical question, even though it would never ask you a serious medical question. So, diabetes is the very well-known disease that involves a problem with insulin. There's two types, and here's how I memorized them. So type 1 diabetes is when you do not have enough insulin. So the glucose is not able to enter the cells. So you look into the bloodstream, there's no insulin there to begin with. We're not going to talk about why. We're not going to mention why. But the fact is that in type 1 diabetes, the insulin simply does not exist in your bloodstream. Insulin is a peptide hormone. Your bloodstream is where it's supposed to be. When you have the affliction known as type 1 diabetes, you do not have that hormone in your bloodstream at all. What You don't have that hormone in your bloodstream. Maybe not at all, but next. Type 2 diabetes. You're desensitized to insulin receptors. So insulin is in the bloodstream, It's there, but it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing because the receptors are no longer sensitized to that molecule. So in type 1 diabetes, you look at the blood, insulin is there. In type 2 diabetes, you look at the blood, insulin is there. So how do we memorize this? Type 1, none. Type 2, the other one. So type 1 is none. There's when we're talking about insulin, there's none to be found. And type 2 is there's insulin because we're not talking about type 1. And yet those insulin receptors are desensitized. A quick word on the action of insulin. It lets glucose into the target cells. So if there's no insulin, glucose can't get into the cells. Myriad effects throughout the whole body. Obviously, glucose not getting into the cells is going to have a broad spectrum of different effects. It's not like one symptom of diabetes is characteristic or defines the whole disease. Type 2 diabetes, the same thing is going to happen because the receptors aren't sensitive to it anymore. So either way, the glucose is staying in the bloodstream. It is not getting into the cell. Glucose in the bloodstream is also known as sugar in the blood. Blood sugar. People with diabetes talk about their blood sugar often because that is the mechanism by which the disease has its effects. You have high blood sugar, but it isn't going into the cells. That is diabetes. That connects to the endocrine system because insulin is an example of a peptide hormone. And from that topic of diabetes, they could test anything related to peptide hormones and their constituent parts, amino acids. So, next, there's a lot of information to memorize about where hormones come from and go to in the body. So now we're going to do that. The general scheme here, when I go through all of these different tissues, is that the hormone comes from one place and it goes to another place for a reason. The hormone goes from one place to another place for a good reason. This system is not random, but it is messy. And it's messy because it evolved over time. It was not designed to be studied easily. So even though everything follows a general scheme of hormone is made here, hormone goes here, has this effect on the organ, that general scheme is just a little bit complicated by where things are coming from, where they're going to. And you may not be familiar with it going into MCAT studying. As a non-traditional student who never took anatomy and physiology in college, I was most certainly not familiar with all of these body parts even when I was studying the endocrine system. So they helped me learn them. And hopefully it is doable for you as well. So here are all of the different endocrine organs and which hormones they release. We got to start with the top dog, the hypothalamus. So there's this funky little group of cells in the brain called the hypothalamus, and they control all of your homeostatic functions. So they control all of the body's functions where things need to be regulated and kept in a certain balance in order to be right. How do they do that? How does the hypothalamus do that? It's by releasing a bunch of different hormones, among other things. But releasing a bunch of different hormones is a big part of it. The hypothalamus is a group of cells, and then it acts upon this other group of cells in the brain, which is called the pituitary gland. So you have the hypothalamus brain structure and then the pituitary gland. Technically another brain structure, but it is of mixed embryological origin. So not every cell that eventually ends up in the pituitary gland of the brain comes from the same place. Not all of it resembles the brain. Some of it actually, at a certain point, looks a little bit more like the mucosa. And that is part of how humans develop into the anatomy and physiology that they eventually come to resemble and that we study in A&P. They need to go through certain changes, and it's not all pretty. It's not just like the brain grows from a seed and it's all contained. No, sometimes there are different parts of the brain, except especially on the edges, as we are now at the base of the brain, sort of right behind the eyes. At the edges, things get a little bit more complicated. It's not all just all from the same place. Okay. and that's going to become important soon. So anyway, you have the hypothalamus, that's proper brain region. Then you have the pituitary gland. It's a little more complicated. Both of them are endocrine glands. That means that both of them produce hormones. The hypothalamus produces a few hormones. The hypothalamus produces a few hormones that I will now list. So the hypothalamus produces GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. Gonadotropin releasing hormone travels to the anterior portion of the pituitary gland and stimulates the release of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. I'm only mentioning gonadotropin releasing hormone now because that's from the hypothalamus, and that's what I'm mentioning here. I'm then going to mention what follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, and luteinizing hormone, or LH, do when I'm talking about the pituitary gland itself. After GnRH, the hypothalamus can release GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone. That travels to the pituitary gland and stimulates the release of growth hormone, or GH, from the anterior pituitary. The next hormone that hypothalamus releases is TRH, or thyrotropin releasing hormone. Thyrotropin releasing hormone travels from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary gland and stimulates there the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. The thyroid gland is a different part of the body that is going to be stimulated by thyroid stimulating hormone. That's where that name comes from, thyroid. So, the next hormone that the hypothalamus releases is CRH, or corticotropin releasing hormone. Corticotropin releasing hormone stimulates the pituitary gland to make adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, which is then released from the anterior portion of the pituitary gland. The next hypothalamic hormone is uh, prolactin inhibiting factor, or dopamine. So, prolactin is one of the hormones that is released by the anterior pituitary gland. And it turns out that dopamine, literally dopamine, is the molecule that from the hypothalamus controls the release of prolactin. So when dopamine is present, prolactin is inhibited. When dopamine is not present, prolactin is released. So another word for dopamine is prolactin inhibiting factor. Next, the hypothalamus releases ADH and oxytocin. So, ADH and oxytocin are not actually put into the bloodstream by the hypothalamus. Instead, they are produced in the cell bodies of neurons in the hypothalamus, and then they travel down to the posterior pituitary gland. So, now that we've gotten confusing enough about the anterior and posterior pituitary gland, why don't we just elaborate those and make them a little bit more clear? First, I'm just going to briefly list out the hypothalamus or hormones again. And if it seems difficult to memorize these now, it will become easier when we discuss their target glands, the anterior pituitary gland and the posterior pituitary gland. Not that the posterior pituitary is targeted by hormones directly, but its hormones are produced in the hypothalamus. So, when it comes to the hypothalamus, we have GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone, thyrotropin, thyrotropin releasing hormone, CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, PIF, or dopamine, prolactin inhibiting factor, or dopamine, and then adrenal antidiuretic hormone, ADH, and oxytocin. The anterior pituitary gland. The pituitary gland has two lobes. It has the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe, the two functional lobes. So they look, uh, the anterior pituitary gland and the posterior pituitary gland function differently as cells because they come from different parts of the body during human development. So, embryogenesis, as the human is developing, the cells that end up turning into the anterior pituitary gland and the cells that end up turning into the posterior pituitary gland come from different places. And the process by which they are compiled into the structure that results and that we would see if we pulled back the human brain and kind of looked at the bottom to see the pituitary gland, um, that process is a highly concerted and just very complex uh, symphony of chemical messaging that results in that. But what we end up with is these two funky lobes, and they act differently. Here's how they act differently. When it comes to the anterior pituitary gland, it's as if it was a different organ in the body from the hypothalamus. So just like any other organ that has endocrine function or responds to an endocrine product, a hormone, it has its connection to its source by the bloodstream. So the anterior pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus via the bloodstream. And indeed, the hypothalamus communicates with the anterior pituitary gland via hormones through the bloodstream because hormones and bloodstream are synonymous. You always need to send them through the bloodstream in order for them to get from the gland to the target organ. That is not the case with the posterior pituitary gland. It is not connected to the hypothalamus via the bloodstream because it can get its hormones from the hypothalamus directly via neurons that go directly from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary gland. So, very different structurally, and yet they are right next to each other. How did they get there? Embryogenesis. They came from different places, but they ended up in the same place. And why do they look so different? It's because they came from different places. Such is the nature of the anterior pituitary gland and the posterior pituitary gland. So, important to note is that the anterior pituitary gland is part of what we call a portal system. So let me find a good definition of a portal system. So a portal So a portal system is a circulatory feature in the body where the blood passes through two capillary beds before it drains into the venous system. So in this case, what we have is two different points at which the blood is interacting directly with cells before it goes back towards the heart. And one of those points in this case is the point at which the hormones are interacting with the hypothalamus and the posterior or the anterior pituitary gland. So that is it's a portal system. This one is called the hypophyseal portal system because of the name of the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland, the name of that structure that they kind of form. One is kind of coming off of the other. The anterior pituitary gland releases its own hormones because it is an endocrine gland. And the memorization technique taught for the anterior pituitary gland hormones is flat peg. And right off the top of my head, I could say the flat peg stands for follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, prolactin, endorphins, and growth hormone. So now I'm just going to elaborate on all of those. Follicle stimulating hormones, FSH. Follicle stimulating hormone is a gonadotropin, which means it goes to the gonads, which is either the testes or the ovaries. So it goes to either one of those, depending on what body it's in. So that's follicle stimulating hormone. It promotes spermatogenesis when it goes to testes, and it stimulates the production of ovarian follicles when it goes to the ovaries. So those have different functions when it comes to the real world, what happens in the bodies, but the general scheme remains that they come from the anterior pituitary and they go to the gonads. That's the F in flat peg. The L in flat peg is called luteinizing hormone. It's another gonadotropin, and like FSH, its release is stimulated by the hypothalamus's release of gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH. So LH, or luteinizing hormone, is a gonadotropin that induces ovulation. So, unlike FSH, which stimulates the growth of ovarian follicles when it goes to the ovaries, this one induces ovulation when it goes to the ovaries. Next is the A in flat peg, and that is adrenocorticotropic hormone, and that stimulates the production and release of cortisol. Cortisol is released from the adrenal cortex. Renal refers to the kidneys. Adrenal is just sitting right on top of the kidneys. The adrenal cortex, the adrenal gland rather, has a medulla, just like in the brain, a deeper structure, and then a cortex, just like in the brain, a structure on the top. So the adrenal cortex releases cortisol, and the stimulation of the release of cortisol is done by adrenocorticotropic hormone. That hormone is released by the anterior pituitary gland. Next is the T in flat peg, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid to produce thyroxine and triiodothyroxine. Thyroxine and triiodothyroxine, T4 and T3, those stimulate metabolism. Important to know here is that TSH goes to the T, the thyroid gland. The P in flat peg is prolactin. It stimulates milk production. I remembered prolactin by thinking of lactation. So prolactation, prolactin stimulates milk production. Next is the E in the flat peg acronym. That stands for endorphins. So we're not going to get into, according to the MCAT, we're not going to get into what endorphins are or what the different kinds are. No, we're just going to call them endorphins, and we're going to say that the pain goes down when those are released. Pain. And that is the E in the flat peg acronym for the anterior pituitary gland. The G, which finishes out our flat peg narrative, is growth hormone. So that is the hormone that is mostly produced at night, I think, and it stimulates growth and cell reproduction. So, as I was saying before, if we didn't have growth hormone and instead we just sort of thought to ourselves, like, oh, like, I wish this muscle just kind of grew a little bit more right now, that would be really weird. And so, to avoid that weirdness, we instead have a hormone, a chemical messenger that's released into the circulation by the anterior pituitary gland that stimulates that growth instead of having a nerve or a brain signal rather go directly to a target organ to stimulate growth. Next is the posterior pituitary gland. So we have the anterior in the front and the posterior in the back. As I mentioned, they are from different origins during embryogenesis, so they act differently. No longer are we talking about hormones that are released in response to hormones released by the hypothalamus. Now we're talking about hormones that did come from the hypothalamus, but they just travel directly to the posterior pituitary gland, dodging the circulatory system entirely via cells, via neurons, nerve cells, modified to do that job of sending chemical products down the pipe from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary gland. Two hormones to remember here: vasopressin and oxytocin. Vasopressin is also known as ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic means anti-release of urine. So antidiuretic hormone is going to regulate the tonicity of your body fluids. And specifically, that means it is going to resorb water, cause the kidneys to resorb water, and it is going to thus have more concentrated urine and less concentrated blood, and reduce urine volume. So, water is the main component of urine and blood. And when you take a little bit of the water out of the urine, it has to go somewhere. It goes into the blood. So you take water out of the urine. You get one, you get less urine. Two, you get more concentrated urine because there's not as much water there. And then three, you got more blood and less concentrated blood. Indeed, this is the function of the kidneys, the organ, the kidneys. They filter out the blood and they produce the urine as sort of a place to put all the things that the body doesn't want to hold on to. And so vasopressin is one of those hormones, happens to be released from the posterior pituitary gland of the brain that travels to the kidneys to regulate its action. Specifically, here we're talking about the water balance function of the kidneys. They do a bunch of other different things, the kidneys. Um, Oxytocin, the second hormone released by the posterior pituitary gland. Oxytocin is a peptide hormone that will, during childbirth, increase uterine contractions and then, after childbirth, promote milk production and bonding behaviors. So this is to me a great example, oxytocin, of how a hormone does not need to act simply in one place in one way. It does travel to different organs in order to produce the aforementioned effects, but it at different times it can serve different functions, and those don't have to be relegated to the first hormone that it had that impact on. So say, before childbirth we're talking about uterine contractions. Well, then after childbirth, we're talking about bonding behavior. This behavioral effect that is entirely regulated by the central nervous system. So oxytocin is just to me a great example of a hormone because it has all these different effects, and yet it's the same molecule that we're talking about. And such is the beauty of the endocrine system. It doesn't have to be a million different nervous pathways. Instead, it's one molecule, but it has different effects depending on when it's released and how. That's oxytocin. That is the second hormone released by the posterior pituitary gland. So we've covered the hypothalamus, we've covered the anterior pituitary, and we've covered the posterior pituitary. That ends the discussion of the brain endocrine glands for the purposes of the MCAT. One other that you might want to know is the pineal gland that releases melatonin. Melatonin is widely known now in the United States because it is sold as a dietary supplement that is said to promote sleep, but it is also produced endogenously by the brain in the pineal gland, which is just tucked into a groove between the two thalamic halves, just kind of at the back of right behind the thalamus. So that is the pineal gland. It produces melatonin. Melatonin is said to regulate sleep and wakefulness and control the circadian rhythms. We don't know exactly how, and we also don't know if eating melatonin is going to help you go to sleep at night. We don't know, but it is still sold that way. So the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary gland, and the posterior pituitary gland, these are the brain structures involved in the endocrine system for the purposes of the MCAT. We're going to keep it there. And we're going to also keep the products there. It actually gets way more complicated than everything I've already mentioned, believe it or not. But this is a good amount of information to memorize already, and it is a good example for the MCAT to put on as a way to get students memorizing and then applying that memorization to different integrated questions. So, as I mentioned before, everything from the molecular structure of these hormones to the different effects that they have on the body in disease states and non disease states can be tested on the MCAT. It is fair game. Where does it all sort of integrate in these names, such as corticotropin releasing hormone? That is one buzzword the MCAT might throw at you. That's why we're thinking of them right now. The next organ that I want to talk about that releases hormones is the pancreas. So, behind the stomach, you'll find a large gland, and it's called the pancreas. And I mentioned diabetes before, and things like blood sugar and the pancreas are buzzwords in discussing diabetes because indeed the pancreas is where insulin comes from, that very important peptide hormone. The cells that the pancreas uses to make insulin have a funky special name, as do the cells that the pancreas use to make all their other hormones. So we're going to memorize those names now, and then we're going to talk about what hormones they produce. So I'm going to start at the beginning of the alphabet here, alpha, and then I'm going to go beta, and then delta. So alpha, beta, delta. Alpha cells release glucagon, beta cells release insulin, delta cells release somatostatin, also known as growth hormone inhibiting hormone, or GHIH. Starting with alpha cells, glucagon. Glucagon is a peptide hormone that secretes when there's glucose in the bloodstream. So glucagon helps glucose. Glucagon is a peptide hormone released by the alpha cells of the pancreas when there is low glucose in the bloodstream. So its job is to help glucose enter the bloodstream. We don't simply get the glucose from our food and put it directly into our cells. Different parts of the body and different systems need to be involved in coordinating that transfer of the glucose molecule. Indeed, one of those systems is the glucagon system, where low glucose in the bloodstream stimulates glucagon release from the pancreas. Glucagon helps glucose enter the bloodstream. Well, what helps glucose come out of the bloodstream? That takes us from alpha cells to beta cells. Beta cells release insulin. So, beta islet cells are the insulin releasing cells. Insulin is a peptide hormone that, when secreted, helps that glucose that is now in the bloodstream enter the target cells. Thus, having no insulin or not being sensitive to insulin anymore will make it so that your glucose does not enter the target cells and so that you can't use glucose. That really messes up the body's whole plan with the glucose because we wanted to use that as an energy molecule, and if it can't get into the cells, well, now it can't be used as an energy molecule. So that's why people with diabetes are so tired all the time, and that's all. There's a myriad symptoms that come from that. So insulin. The last is somatostatin, or growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So GHIH is a peptide hormone released by the delta cells of the pancreas. It inhibits growth hormone, certainly, but it also leads to a decrease in both insulin and glucagon. And for the purposes of the MCAT, we keep it there. We don't ask why. We do not ask why, but we just say that somatostatin decreases insulin, decreases glucagon, and it also decreases growth hormone. Doesn't that seem a little contradictory? Don't overthink it. We're just going to move on. After the pancreas, I want to talk about, let's go with another abdominal thing here. Let's talk about the adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex. So, going from the inside to the outside now, some of those catecholamines, which are the single amino acid derived hormones, are going to be released from the adrenal medulla. Um, so, what is the amino acid, the special amino acid that is turned into the catecholamines? That is tyrosine. So, tyrosine, the amino acid that has the three-letter abbreviation TYR and the one-letter abbreviation Y, it has a phenyl group and then a hydroxyl as its side chain. So it's CH2 phenyl hydroxyl group. It looks like this. And tyrosine is converted into catecholamines. Let's talk about a couple of them because they're released from the adrenal medulla, and that is the gland that we are talking about. Sitting on top of the kidneys, on the very inside, it is hiding. It is the adrenal medulla. So, epinephrine increases heart rate, increases blood pressure, primarily a hormone, also an antihistamine. Epinephrine is also known as adrenaline. You have an epinephrine rush, you have an adrenaline rush. You need epinephrine injected into you immediately because you're having an allergic reaction. You need adrenaline injected into you immediately because you're having an allergic reaction. They're synonymous. It's an antihistamine. Antihistamine, allergic reaction. Epinephrine inhibits the histamine, stops the allergic reaction. Norepinephrine is also a hormone and a neurotransmitter, also a catecholamine that increases heart rate and blood pressure, and it inhibits insulin. So insulin production, helping glucose come into the cells once it's in the bloodstream. Norepinephrine inhibits that. Why might you want insulin not to be letting glucose into cells from the bloodstream. Well, what if we're in a fight or flight state and we suddenly need that glucose for a different purpose than whatever the insulin sensitive cells are doing? Some cells aren't actually sensitive to insulin. It's a complication, one of many that the MCAT sort of glosses over. But when it comes to something like norepinephrine, we must consider it because one of the actions of norepinephrine is to inhibit insulin. Finally, the adrenal medulla releases dopamine, a small amount of dopamine. Dopamine is released and received by so many different parts of the body. It's such a catch-all sort of catecholamine sort of neurotransmitter. One of the things it does, like in the brain, is that it inhibits the release of prolactin. So, a million things dopamine. We don't need to get into it. We'll learn dopamine when we get into different topics, such as like schizophrenia or Parkinson's disease, because that's just more specific, and we don't need to talk about it here. Coming outside of the adrenal medulla, you have the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex releases a few different things. The adrenal cortex releases three different classes of hormones that the MCAT wants you to know. And I say classes because it's a bunch of different hormones, but they have general categories that you can sort of suss out the meaning of when you look at the names. Glucocorticoids. So, corticoids, they come from the cortex. Gluco, they have something to do with glucose. So, cortisol is a glucocorticoid. It increases glucose in the bloodstream and it decreases the immune system and protein synthesis. Cortisol is released during stress. Stress is a time when you would want more glucose in the bloodstream. You would want less energy spent on the immune system, and you would want less energy spent on the synthesis of new proteins. You don't want to be building up. Here you just want to be using, getting out of whatever situation caused you to be stressed on the macro level. Cortisone is similar to cortisol. It decreases the immune response, which includes things like inflammation and the allergic response. Mineral corticoids. Minerals is just another fancy name for the ions that are created by different elements on the periodic table that we need in order to survive. They work as really important cofactors for enzymes. So, mineral corticoids are things like aldosterone, which increases sodium in the bloodstream by action on the kidneys, and it also increases blood pressure. And what regulates aldosterone? Aldosterone is regulated by potassium concentration and angiotensin 2 concentration. Angiotensin 2 comes from angiotensin 1. That is mentioned here because the action of a very important class of blood pressure lowering medication is to inhibit the cleaving of angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. I don't think angiotensin 1 has any impact on the body. Angiotensin 2, though, that's a heavy hitter. One of them is the aldosterone regulation. Okay. So that was mineral corticoids. Mineral corticoids, I think of kidney. I think of how the kidney regulates the salt balance of the body, the mineral balance of the body. And so the hormone that acts on the kidneys is going to be a mineral regulating sort of hormone. Next are androgens. So the adrenal cortex also releases testosterone and estrogen. No. Okay, so the adrenal cortex also releases these hormones called androgens that are then converted to testosterone or estrogen, testosterone and estrogen in the gonads, so in the reproductive organs. So androgens, the precursors to those hormones that we know and love, testosterone and estrogen, released from the gonads. That comes from the adrenal cortex, the outer portion of that funky little endocrine gland that sits on top of the kidneys. All right. All right, so we did the brain, we did the pancreas, we did the other abdominal. Let's go up first, and then we'll finish with the gonads. So going up into the neck, we have the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland releases a couple of hormones that MCAT wants you to know. Back to our discussion of the anterior pituitary gland, one of the released hormones from that gland is thyroid stimulating hormone. Well, when we're stimulating the thyroid, what exactly is it that we're stimulating? Here's what. So we're stimulating metabolism, and really just regulating metabolism. So when you have an organ that's important for the control of metabolism, you could either increase it or decrease it. What's going to cause that change? It's partially it's going to be hormones. So T4 and T3 are those products that thyroid stimulating hormone ends up causing the release of: thyroxine and triiodothyronine, T4 and T3 respectively. T4 is a precursor to T3. It regulates metabolism. That's all you have to know. Metabolism, the use of energy molecules in our body, regulating increases or decreases. That's what T4 and T3 do. Tyrosine, as is sort of suggested by the name, tyrosine is again where these sorts of hormones come from, and iodine is included in the production of them as well, as suggested by the name again, T4 and T3. Next is calcitonin. So calcitonin is a calcium regulating hormone, and it comes from the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland, not just metabolism when it comes to the use of glucose, but also metabolism when it comes to the regulation of, but also calcium regulation. Calcium, a mineral that serves many different functions on the cellular level in the body. It increases calcitonin, increases calcium in the bone. It increases calcium excretion from kidneys. It decreases the calcium in the blood as a result from those two things, and it decreases calcium absorption in the gut so that you don't get any more calcium into the blood. So I see here three main effects and then one sort of result effect. So one, more calcium in the bone. Two, more calcium peed out after they go through the kidneys. Three, less calcium absorbed in the gut. What is the result of all of those three? A decrease in calcium in the blood, because indeed the blood is the pathway through which calcium would have gotten to the bone, would have been excreted through the kidneys, and would have been added to by absorption in the gut. So, thyroid gland, T3 and T4, metabolism generally, and then calcitonin, which decreases calcium in the blood. After the thyroid gland, we finally come to the next. After the thyroid gland, naturally comes the parathyroid glands. So they're kind of in and around the thyroid glands, but they're called the parathyroid glands. The parathyroid glands function to maintain the body's calcium and potassium levels properly. Um, Parathyroid hormone is the main hormone product I want to discuss here, PTH. And PTH, unlike calcitonin, inhibits the breakdown of bone. So, breakdown of bone, decrease of calcium in bone, thus a decrease in calcium excretion from the kidneys, thus an increase in calcium absorption from the gut. What is the result on the bloodstream concentration of calcium of all those three things? Increase. So, it's the opposite of calcitonin. As long as you memorize what the effect of calcitonin is, all you got to know is that the other calcium affecting hormone does the exact opposite. Calcitonin increases calcium in the bone, increases calcium excretion from the kidneys, increases the sorry, calcitonin increases calcium in the bone, increases calcium excretion from the kidneys, decreases calcium absorption in the gut, and thus decreases calcium in the blood. Parathyroid hormone decreases calcium in bone, decreases the excretion of calcium from the kidneys, increases calcium absorption in the gut. It activates vitamin D in order to do that, also known as calcitriol, and then it increases calcium in the blood as a result of all those other things, because that's what causes calcium to be in the blood. We've covered the thyroid glands, we've covered the parathyroid glands. Last but certainly not least is the gonads. So, the gonads are the gland that produces the sex cells, and they also produce what is known as the sex hormones. So, there's these group of cells in our reproductive organs, generally, that have these two major functions. One of them is cellular, and the other is molecular. Cellular, it produces sex cells. So that is either the sperm or the egg. And molecular, in that it produces sex hormones. Sex hormones are very important for the proper maturation of the human body, important for things like adolescence, three hormones that are produced by the gonads. One is testosterone. Testosterone is produced by the testes and the ovaries, and a small bit by the adrenal cortex. And testosterone is the primary sex hormone when it is released by the testes, and it is also an anabolic steroid. So, anabolic steroid, anabolic building up, steroid simply refers to the molecular structure of the molecule. So, the testosterone being a steroid hormone, it is derived from that four ringed cholesterol structure. And then where does it come out of? It comes from either the testes or from the ovaries or from the adrenal cortex. Next is estrogen. So, unlike the testes, it is produced by the ovaries, estrogen. It is important for the menstrual cycle. That is what I think of the most when I think of estrogen. It also decreases milk production. Then there is third is progesterone. So progesterone is also produced by the ovaries, just like estrogen. It is also just like estrogen, to my ears, important for the proper progression of the menstrual cycle. Particularly, progesterone prepares the endometrium for potential pregnancy following ovulation. So the endometrium, that part of the uterus that the eventual embryo is going to be in, well, how do we stimulate the sort of development of that every month roughly? We use a hormone like progesterone. So that is the last hormone produced by the gonads that the MCAT wants you to know: testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. So in recapping, we've discussed the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary gland, the posterior pituitary gland, the pineal gland, the adrenal medulla, the adrenal cortex, the thyroid gland, the parathyroid gland, and the gonads, and also the pancreas. I don't know if I mentioned pancreas first, but cannot forget the pancreas. It's very important. So I just want to quickly look to see if there's any other topic I didn't talk about when it comes to hormones. I think I covered the majority of things there. What else do I want to say here? Content categories. Oh, one important topic when it comes to the release of hormones is feedback. So when you send out a chemical messenger, it's not always as simple as you tell part of the body to do something and then it does it and then that's the end of the story. The body doesn't really know when to stop sending hormones, and indeed if there is a certain pathology, it might just keep sending a certain kind of hormone and not know when to stop. And there's just a litany of different diseases that can occur, and that's why there's an entire medical specialty called endocrinology that you can specialize in after internal medicine. But if the body is working, in a non-pathological state, it is going to have what's called feedback mechanisms. So the most classic sort of example of this in the abstract is you release a certain hormone into the bloodstream. It gets to its target organ. That target organ then does something or releases something, and then back to wherever that hormone was released from, that gland gets a signal to say, yeah, it's time to ease off. We released enough of that. Like it's, we've had enough. So we're not going to send any more of that hormone out. That would be a typical negative feedback mechanism, because more of that hormone would then cause less of the stimulation of that hormone. And indeed, that's how it works for many different hormones. Some hormones, though, actually have what is called a feed forward mechanism. So the hormone releases the 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 gland rather the gland releases the hormone goes into the body, does its thing, and then that thing stimulates the release of more of the hormone from the gland. And typically this occurs when a certain job is to be done. So indeed, it's not an endless cycle of releasing hormone and effect of the hormone. It's usually when there's a pretty dramatic and discrete action that needs to be taken by the body. What's an example of that? Childbirth. So oxytocin is produced by the posterior pituitary. It increases uterine contractions, it increases the production of milk, and when the baby is born, it increases positive bonding behavior between the mother and the baby. But oxytocin, when it's responsible for uterine contractions, it sort of doesn't know when to stop, and indeed it just keeps going until the baby is born, until the uterine contractions are no longer necessary, because the thing that the uterine is contracting to push out has been pushed out. So oxytocin before childbirth, it has this feed forward mechanism where it just keeps going. And so more uterine contraction stimulates more release of oxytocin from the posterior pituitary gland, and then eventually the uterine doesn't need to be contracting anymore. Um, the posterior pituitary gland is connected to the uterus via the bloodstream, and thus this is sort of the way I want to close out this live stream, because I want to just emphasize the fact that this is a different way for our body to do things that relies on the bloodstream rather than a series of neurons. You have neurons that are responsible for the sometimes the production or the communication or the coordinated release of hormones, but they're not the whole story. We need more than neurons and nervous impulses to communicate different signals in our body. And we need them to do different things in our body. You don't have a hormone that can just make your fingers go like that, because boy, would it take a while for a molecule to be secreted from a tiny little bundle of cells in my brain, travel all the way through my entire circulatory system, out to my finger, into the muscles of my finger, and have them contract in that way at a moment's notice. No, that needs to be done by at the speed of an electric impulse. However, when we're talking about something like adolescence and puberty and the maturation into an adult human, that shouldn't happen as fast. That would be weird to happen as fast, and maybe there will be mistakes along the way. We have the endocrine system to cover all of those functions that the nervous system doesn't do when it comes to controlling the action of the body. So it's an integrative topic on the MCAT. It's not an organ system that the MCAT wants you to know. It's a combination of fundamental chemistry, biology, and psychology topics that the MCAT wants you to know. Indeed, I didn't really stress it, but things like when we're talking about cortisol are intimately related to psychology. Dopamine, intimately related to psychology. It combines three main science sections on the MCAT. All of the science sections on the MCAT, in fact. And so each of these sections, the endocrine system is fair game. Why? Because it's an integrative topic. And it's one that I encourage my students to have a very strong grasp on, because from that foundation topic, the MCAT can test countless secondary topics that you would then need to call upon and know to call upon at the right time. Thank you for watching. And if you want to book me as your MCAT tutor, I am still accepting new students at the times listed on my website. My website is aidenmcat.com. Thanks again and have a great day.